Class number 4 is on compression and limiting. Okay, so really one of the things that I'll start off with is talking about the concept of frequency density. And so when we get into frequency density, what we're really talking about is our ability to perceive imaging. All right, let's just put it that way. So in other words, frequency density means that if we look at our frequency response from 20 to 20 kilohertz, right? So we'll just kind of go here with our very common graph. Right, 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz. So what happens is the overall mix may have a certain sonic characteristic, right? And so we kind of see that there. But where is the density of the sound within that mix, right? So if it sounds kind of muddy, that may mean that we have too much density here in the low or low mid frequency range. Or maybe if it sounds a little bit too bright or lacks presence, it may have less or not enough density over here. So what we're really talking about is when we work with compression, what we're really trying to do is we're trying several things, right? We're trying to deal with gain, right? And perceived level. Now, the perceived level means is like perceived loudness, right? Which has not necessarily everything to do with frequency content. That has something to do with it. But our perceived gain versus what shows up on the actual meter are two very different things. In other words, you can actually have one mix, two mixes side by side, and one of them, they both peak at 0, right? Or they're both right before 0. And one will sound twice as loud as the other, right? And so much of this is about not what the top is doing, because if the top is poking out in any area, we'll limit or control that, right? And we could bring up the overall gain. But most of it is about how far down does it go, right, on the other side. And this is where we get into working with the density of the sound. So if we can focus in on areas that are deficient, okay, then what we could do is we could actually take and move our audio signal, right, and bring up the frequency area that's deficient and bring it back up from the bottom up. This can be done with a variety of different types of processing, right? We could do it with some basic compression, right? So one very common technique of transparent compression is to have a very low ratio, right? So we have a low ratio, and I mean really low, right? So we may be like 1.1 to 1, right? Something really simple like that. And then we set our attack and release, to be sort of medium, right? So we want to have a little bit of movement, right? So this is kind of medium-ish or medium fast. And then we set a very low threshold. Right, so what happens is that we're taking the overall sound, okay, and we're decreasing or or bringing closer together. Let's just say the top and the bottom. So maybe our original mix is like this. So we set a low level threshold here, and then we compress it all with a very low ratio, and then what we end up with is something that looks like this, right? So we're kind of pulling everything a little bit tighter together. So now this low-level energy stuff is up closer to the top. And this should immediately bring in presence and overall perceived volume without really changing what the final result is, right? In other words, the mix should still fundamentally hold together and sound the same, okay? And this is a great way of equalizing out the overall levels, right? Getting some kind of general good base level. And what it does is it prevents you from having to do too much later on, right? So, so really what ends up happening then is that once we've gone about the process of kind of tightening up the overall mix and making it overall a little bit louder, right, we can focus in on particular areas. And this can be done with either multiband compression or by the way that we apply the compression. So if we slow down the attack, for example, right, if we slow down the attack, then we can allow the transient peaks to kind of cut through a little bit more, right? So let's kind of take the sound, over time, right? So now our graph here is time instead of frequency. And so we may have, right, within the given song, we'll have peaks that sort of stick out, okay? And so by slowing down the attack and setting a higher threshold, we can actually create some short dips after these peaks, and what it does is it doesn't really increase the gain of the peak, but what we're really doing is we're kind of separating those peaks and making them stick out a little bit more perception-wise from everything else, right? So we kind of have this fast or short or medium attack and fast release type of thing, right? And then what we could do is we can actually bring out some presence or some aliveness. So the more sustained energy is separated from the transient peaks, right? So the quick way, actually, I'm just going to zip in here with you guys because I'm kind of watching this going along here. And John, should just, call in. There's a number, right? It's a phone number. Right, and then you could just listen to and you could call into that phone number. It's actually right here, right? 530-881-1212. And then you dial in the PIN number, right? And or the meeting ID number it'll ask for, and then you should be able to tune in audio-wise, and then you could watch what's going on, and then we'll sort out the audio afterwards. So sorry, that's kind of like kind of pulled everything down here, right? So anyway. All right, so when we're dealing with the processing of compression, we can actually work and control some of the dynamic, make it pump and breathe a little bit, move a little bit, and increase the dynamic, right? So this is some basic compression techniques. So we have the transparent, kind of crunch the overall gain thing. We can also increase some of the dynamic movement with a little pumping and breathing type of compression. So the release time is set more kind of to the tempo of the song that you're mastering. And then you could start to get into limiting technology and multiband technology. And when we get to the multiband technology, then we go back to frequencies, right? So if we're dealing with a multiband compressor, we can compress within particular frequency areas where we need more density. And we could leave those areas that are okay on their own, right? Maybe we can even limit or bring down certain frequency areas, right? And so what we created is like a dynamic EQ, right? And so by working with this kind of dynamic equalization technique, the movement will occur where the frequencies occur, right? And this is much more powerful than EQ, right? Because you're basically pumping and breathing the frequencies that you need when you need them, okay? And the cool thing about the multiband, right, when you're working with the multiband stuff, is that it becomes like you have gain control. So you still have your like normal kind of equalization processing techniques, just by adding gain or taking away gain and then moving the frequency bands around, right? Because these frequencies will vary, right? So this will be, 20 cycles here, and then our first crossover, right, might be at 90 cycles or 85 cycles. Our second crossover, maybe at 500. The next crossover may be at 5K, right? Wherever you decide to move these bands, we'll focus them in within the particular range that you want to work with, right? So this is going to be a very powerful step in the process. So when we get to multiband limiting, then we're taking the peak that happened in such a short period of time that they don't, limiting them doesn't really change the sound quality. And by working in multiband limiting, peak limiting, what we can do is we can take the peaks out in the frequency areas where they happen most audibly. So most transient peaks will happen in this upper mid-range band, not down low. And those transient peaks will happen sharply there, so you can actually process them there without affecting what's going on in the other bands, right? And so that's another way of working with the peak limiting technology. And this way, it usually kind of they usually kind of spread a little bit of the workload, so it off to the bands on either side, and we'll go over that process as well. But this way, you can actually really kind of bring out the sound, make it come alive, and really maximize the gain with doing a minimum of artifacts, right, or minimum of effect negatively, right, on the actual audio signal. Right, so this is a real key, right? So the multiband processing, right, is a really powerful way to kind of bring out all of that stuff. So I love compression and I love limiting technology. So this is just like, you're going to get a lot out of this, right, in terms of the way that you work. And it's really going to help you a lot in terms of the mastering process, right?